Hello and welcome to the Wormhole Podcast, episode 44. I'm Charlie Place, and joining me today is the author of the pacey and literary thriller Your Still Beating Heart, which was the literary sofa book of the year last year. Hello, Tyler Keevil.
Hello, Charlie. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to discussing the book and the craft.
Excellent. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Yeah, I've been having a pretty good summer, considering we're emerging from such a tumultuous year and a half, and just trying to enjoy all the moments and get outside as much as we can.
So I want to start with your profession as such. You are the director of the MA in Creative Writing at Cardiff University. What does that entail?
That involves a range of things, and I'll try not to bore our listeners here with the minutiae of the administrative work. The exciting aspects involve teaching our postgraduate students, run workshops and seminars on the craft, and it also involves running open days, talking about the course, and also hosting a range of guests and industry professionals that we bring in to talk to the students as well. So there's that practical aspect, which is so much a part of creative writing programs everywhere now. But it's also gratifying for me. Just before we started recording, we were talking about one of our alumni, Susmita Bhattacharya, and she came back to talk to our students recently. So I get to reconnect with people and old friends, but also bring in people I might not have met previously and whose work I really admire to share their expertise with students. So it's a range of things, and it's different. Every day presents new excitement, new challenges, things to overcome.
So do you get to be on effectively my side of this recording? Do you interview people?
It's interesting you mentioned that, because generally pre-COVID, when we had the capability of bringing in our guests, we would have them just come into the classroom and they would run a seminar on the craft, and then they would also workshop the students' works, offer their critique, which is always nice and exciting to get that external point of view. I think students will get tired of us tutors after a while, so you have a new voice in the mix and somebody whose work they'll have read in advance. We ran into the obvious obstacles in doing that during last year when we weren't even in the classroom with students, so there was no chance of bringing guests in. And so I did run conversations similar in my own fumbling, bumbling way to the podcast that you run, in that I even called it that. I asked the students to provide me with some questions in advance for each guest. But I think we're hoping to get back to the more typical guest writer series this forthcoming year.
So, hopefully quick summary of the book. Your Still Beating Heart is told in the second person by an unnamed narrator. Eira loses her husband in a violent attack on a bus, and the event leaves her completely numb and not knowing where to go from there. She travels to Prague because that's where she and Todd were engaged, but she's got no plans. Once there, she's greeted by a man who offers her a one-time job on the basis that she looks like a completely harmless British woman. There's some kind of trafficking involved. Eira agrees to it. She doesn't care about anything anymore, but perhaps that's easy to say when it's likely to be no more than drugs. And Tyler, you have a reading from the beginning for us.
That's right. I thought I would read the opening chapter, or the start of the opening chapter, which is entitled An Ending. So this is how your husband dies. Not 40 years from now, coughing, wilting, consumed from within by cancer, holding your hand, looking into your eyes, the irises reflecting a lifetime of companionship. Not 20 years from now, after the kids you haven't had yet grow up and leave home and no longer need him. And you don't either, at least not as much. Not 10 years from now, around the time you expect him to have a midlife crisis, buy a Ford convertible, start flirting ineptly and inappropriately with the staff in coffee shops. No, your husband doesn't die in any of those ways, but now, tonight, on a slow, cold, rainy Thursday at the end of November, when he's 29 years old. He dies in London, a city he never liked and very far from home. He dies on a bus, of all places, at 10:34 p.m. He dies because he loves you. He dies because he's brave, or maybe insecure. Sometimes it's hard to tell. He dies because he doesn't want to see you hurt or scared. He dies because he's stupid. He dies because he doesn't think. He dies because he believes it's his job to protect you. He dies because maybe you believe this too and expect it of him. You don't know why he dies. You know the how, but not the why. This is the how. After a film at the cinema, Todd didn't particularly want to go. He'd spent the afternoon teaching Tolstoy to hungover first years, but he could tell you did. And so we had a cup of coffee and you caught the tube down to Trafalgar Square, a 31-minute trip. The film turns out to be a British kitchen sink drama, as dreary as the weather. Todd's going to be polite about it, but you can feel his skepticism, his resistance to it, the shifting in his seat, the moving of his elbow on and off the armrest. Then the rolling of credits, the filtering of audience members towards the exit, all of them glum, listless, their faces drawn and gray from the glare of the projector, like extras in the film that's just ended. Outside, there's construction at the entrance to the tube. But a bus is coming, looming large, streaked with rain and grime. Should we take the bus? His idea. You trot together across the street, the headlights of passing cars carving funnels through the rain. A big puddle by the curb. He jumps first, stops to extend his hand to you, which you take not because you need it, but out of the same courtesy that made him offer. Inside the bus, the heat is up, the windows are steamed, the aisle is slick with rain dripping off passengers' coats and boots. You can't see the city beyond the glass, just a rapid blur of darkness and light. Something about running in the rain, the cold, the impulsive movement, has loosened you both up. The gloom of the cinema has fallen away like a cloak. The two of you talk about the movie like you might have when you first met, rather than simply viewing it together and digesting it separately, agreeing to disagree. Instead, your chat is animated, with you stubbornly defending the film, and Todd trying to convince you what was wrong with it, with the whole genre, the lack of structure, the dismal stoicism, the working class stereotypes. If he's talking too loudly, you don't notice. If he's coming across as American, loud, brash, knowing, confident, it's almost a relief, a release. This is what he is, or once was, your American husband with his American name, Todd, before living in Britain made him small. You'll remember thinking, Todd looks good. He looks happy. And then the shouting. Shut up. Shut up. There's a man at the front of the bus. It's unclear who he's talking to at first, if anybody, but he's standing now, out of his seat, a pale, wired, skin-headed man, dressed in a hoodie, torn jeans. Shut the hell up, he says again. He's glaring around, skittishly. Other passengers look down, away, in that instinctive manner, avoiding eye contact, but you don't. Later, you'll wonder why. The man spots you, fixates on you, begins to advance, coming down the aisle. I'll leave it there on that ominous note.
Obviously, I could start in many ways with these questions, but I'm going to go with a question that's probably going to say straight away how I read this book and where I came at it from and all that kind of thing.
Okay.
Is the story we are told about Eira real in terms of the fiction, or is it an attempt at a piece of writing by our struggling fictional creative?
That was an excellent question. I mean, I think you can add that layer to it. Definitely. I think it is in that it's a fictional story and it's a book by a struggling creative and that we're all struggling creatives. And it was my creation and wearing the mask of this narrative persona. And I think it's open to that interpretation. I also think a lot of readers don't want to believe in the story and believe that aspect of it is real in the way that any fictional space we enter is, that these characters are important in the moment and we want to go on them with the journey. And that's actually, it's an excellent question, because an initial draft had a more playfully metafictional, particularly finale, the last chapter, and also when the narrator intrudes on the narrative, it was more revealing that it was a fictional construct. So in a way, I think you're detecting the subcurrents of that earlier rendition. And what's really interesting, and now I'm getting taken back to the editorial process, early readers, and including my editor and my agent, they didn't like that. They didn't like the slightly more metafictional or author's commentary on the story, and moments when he might say, for example, oh, I couldn't really have known what happened then. Clearly, he's not there in large portions of it. And it is all speculative if you stop to think of in terms of his relation to Eira, and he's only a passing acquaintance. And so I think that's all there, but they found it irritating, and people found that it got in the way of her journey. And it was a way of him forefronting himself, and he was a kind of nuisance author. So I took on board that advice and toned that way down. But obviously there's a kind of layer of it still there that you're picking up on, but nobody's asked about that previously. So yeah, thank you. And it took me a moment to recall that whole subtext and subcurrent that we originally had a little bit more forefronted.
Well, given what you said about the nuisance and him being annoying, I mean, he is slightly, but in a really good way. So I don't want it to sound like he still is, if there was any questions there, definitely.
Thanks.
So you mentioned yourself as part of this, and that was something that I was wondering. How much of you yourself is in this book?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. And I think probably of all my books, there's the least of me. At the same time, I find it really difficult to attain a degree or level of authenticity without finding some personal connection somehow to my characters, the situation, and the narrative. And I remember my agent, Becky Thomas, joking once, oh, there's always a bit of Tyler in there somewhere, So I think that applies here as well. And it's no accident that the narrator, when he reveals himself, he's the Canadian boy in that classroom. And certain aspects of the backstory resonate with me as well. And it's almost as if you're splitting your personality, or there's a kind of psychic schism that occurs because all of Eira's wanderings around Prague resonate with me and my memories of when I spent time there, because I wasn't there for her reasons. I wasn't there because I was grieving. I was there because I'd gone off to Prague and I thought that's what you need to do to learn to write, or I wanted to kind of isolate myself and have an exciting experience as a young person after graduating from university. When I arrived, I just had this suitcase full of books and I didn't know anybody, and I found it really hard to meet people, make connections. So I did spend a lot of time writing, yes, but also wandering around the city in the cold without much money to do the kind of touristy things that I might have been able to do if I did have the funds. So that was a fundamental experience for me. So there's a little bit of me and Eira there. There's a bit in the narrator, I imagine some of the other characters as well. So I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, but there's not a kind of truthfulness or authenticity, anything. It is a fictional piece, but I needed those handles and I need that aspect. I couldn't imagine setting this anyplace else.
No, it does answer the question. I mean, one of the things that I was thinking about as I was reading, knowing the kind of basic background, I suppose, was similar between you and the narrator. I was wondering if the narrator was, to some extent, you, or if it was you working through him to work through something else, your study of a study sort of thing. That is interesting to hear that there's a bit of you in many of the characters.
Yeah, I think that's the case. And maybe it's always the case. We tend to be a bit wary of identifying with our narrators. I've become more so like that. I think earlier works that were entirely in first person, say from a young man's point of view when I was a young man at the time, and then people read that and they directly read you as author into the character just because it's written in first person. I mean, it's a classic conundrum. And at the same time, as readers, we all also seek to identify with the author. We kind of like that sense of authenticity, and we like the story behind the story. But I think it's a dangerous game to play as author to say, yeah, this narrator is me, because you need that objective distance too. And you need your character to do things that you wouldn't do and to behave in ways you wouldn't, because that's the drama, that's the narrative story, that's the art of storytelling. There's an interesting aspect, like you said, that the Canadian narrator is trying to build a story that he doesn't have full access to. So in a way, you could read that also as a kind of metaphor for the artistic process.
Well, I mean, even in that beginning there is this kind of thing where it feels like he's adding detail and he's adding a bit more thrill than there might even have been, even with the violence and the horror of it. But I did want to ask, why the second-person narrative, given it's so controversial?
Yes, now, and that's interesting, and it ties nicely into that opening chapter, because initially I had aspects of the narrative in my head in the story, like the arc of her journey, but I just wanted to write that first chapter. I was thinking of it as a kind of classic hook, this write it in second person, make it intense and make it gripping, and lure the reader in with this quite big moment, and then move into a more traditional third person narration. And I'd been reading a couple authors at the time who inspired me. I really love Joyce Carol Oates, and I love what she does with second person in some of her short stories. And often people say that it's a tricky thing to manage second person, and it probably works better in a short form. And I did. I went back to third person. I wrote chapters 2 and 3, and I think parts of 4 in third person. And I just found myself losing interest, and I found the momentum that opening had generated tapering off. And that was a bad sign. And I went back and I thought, well, is it possible to write the majority of this text in second person? And when you're not interested yourself, then I think you're in real danger of boring your readers or losing your readers. And I was interested in the second person. I loved the rush and the kind of sense of exhilaration I'd had in writing that first chapter. And so I just thought I'd try it and see how far I could sustain it. And you don't necessarily know, it'll last the whole novel. And in a way, it doesn't quite last the whole novel, because I have these kind of breather moments where the first person narrator steps in and kind of interludes. I think of them as act breaks or intermissions because they come between. So I didn't quite make the whole novel, but the most of it is. It was a challenge, but one that I really enjoyed and found exhilarating. And I hope that the results are exhilarating for readers and for our listeners.
Well, I know that when I was reading it, I was waiting to find out if he was the bad guy. Maybe it's because I've read other thrillers and things like that where you read the narrative of the predator or something like that. And then I was also wondering, like, who is he to be someone to tell the story? Which I think your second person really emphasised, the relative unimportance of him compared to the rest of what's going on.
That's right, that he has a walk-on part and a very small role in the proceedings. And at the same time, the reveal at the end, from what you're saying, you thought he might actually be on the pursuers or on the side of the villains?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah. And even if that isn't quite the case, he is guilty of something. And in a way, that sense of guilt and his conscience is driving, I think, the impulse to write it all down and to work through that and to find some solace or sense of absolution because of the way he betrays Eira ultimately. And that was one of the aspects, I think, in the original finale, we moved away from slightly, because he implied a bit more that maybe, particularly in how she gets away, he exaggerated or made up, because it becomes more dramatic to the point of melodrama in the sequences where she's escaping on the frozen lake. And would that be feasible? Would that be possible? And those kinds of questions, which I think are there. And I think some readers still wonder. So he's wrestling with what he did, what his role is, and what's he responsible for. And that's kind of charging his impulse to write her story.
Well, when you get to that bit where he's kind of revealing all of this, I couldn't help wondering if in writing what he's writing, although, we don't know who he's writing for in terms of if it would see publication or anything like that, but in doing what he's doing, he's potentially causing more problems for her. He's allowing the story to get out.
That's really true. He would be, to a certain extent, revealing her or outing her location. But I think the back of my mind, the fact that they know where she was going or wanting to get to, if he could do it, then other people could as well, was part of the rationale. And I suppose at that point also, it's where the idea of the realism of the story comes up against the fictionality of it, and that you need this conclusion or you need some sense of closure. So maybe that whole angle is something that is left unsaid, because you're very right. If this was a real story, it would be a second betrayal.
Yeah. We'll go back to him in a bit. I feel that we're kind of talking about him and concentrating so much, but obviously we've got Eira here, who I haven't had a question about. It seems very bad. So you've got Eira, the main character. What was behind the small exploration of what she can now do now that her husband is gone? She can now smoke. She fully acknowledges that she dislikes his music, even while she's listening to it, and so on.
It might have emerged from wanting to avoid something rather than initially going towards something, if that makes sense. And one thing I really wanted to avoid was overly romanticizing their relationship and her memories of Todd. And if every moment was viewed through a rose-tinted lens, that it was only these good things that she was remembering of him, I think it would ring really false, and it would be far less interesting. And I wanted to find a bit more of a balance and to look in an honesty at their relationship. And I think somebody mentioned that in any relationship, because you're not the same person as the other person, you make compromises and you adapt certain aspects of your personality, perhaps, to be compatible. And in a way, it's a trade-off, but what you're trading to a certain extent is a sense of autonomy or aspects of your personality that are still there, but that are just perhaps toned down. And I think that those moments where she's feeling not just Todd is gone and I'm so sad and melancholy and in shock, but a sense of liberation almost, in a way that's maybe transgressive, or that socially we tend to think, well, when somebody's passed on, then we only want to remember the good things and we want the eulogies and we want to sing their praises. But perhaps, and everybody's experience is different, of course, and maybe there are perfect relationships out there where none of this happens. But the reality is a bit more nuanced and shaded and balanced, and that there's things that emerge that have been beneath the surface and that are coming to the air to breathe again and to emerge, to reemerge, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Obviously, Todd's death starts this whole thing off, as you could say, and he is in her thoughts. How crucial is his presence, or lack of presence, I suppose you could say? How crucial is that to the story as a whole?
I think it's fundamental. I think that's why it's the beginning, titled The Ending, because it's the ending of that other life that they were living together in. And when that previous life comes to an end, that's when this new story can begin, because she moves into a different sphere and it triggers everything in a way. It's the catalyst for her leaving London to go to Prague to try to make some sense of what's happened and perhaps to reconnect. She doesn't even know quite why she might be going herself. But then it's because of that, because she's gone there and because of the state that she's in, is how she comes in contact with Mario and then gets drawn into this criminal scheme. And also it's her state that allows her to say yes to it. And the old Eira would never have entered into that bargain and that pact. And she also wouldn't have then gone against it or broken it.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned the chapter heading there that it starts off. You've got these wonderful descriptive chapter titles that inform the reader, whether immediately or as they're reading, dependent on each chapter, what it hinges on. And they're almost like short stories in themselves. I kind of thought some sort of, it's not a fractured narrative, but all these stories connected together. In terms of the writing itself, this structure, why did you choose to write in this way?
It's the only time that I've done that, because when I look at my previous novels, they all have just the traditional chapter numbers. And I think you've really hit on it, that it is slightly fractured and it is a little more disjointed than, say, again, my previous work, where I wanted each chapter to have a real intensity in and of itself. And again, you've already said it, that the feeling of a short story rather than just a chapter. And it allowed me to move the narrative along more swiftly, because you didn't have those moments of filler or the bridges between the moments of drama. You could go from one moment of drama to the next with a force and a sense of pace that would otherwise have been lacking. And also, I think in the drafting process, I'd often write those down before I wrote the chapter. They might change later, but it allowed me to hang the vision for that chapter on a theme or an image. And it gave me a sense of purpose and focus. And I hadn't thought of it till now, but it's interesting. We were talking earlier about teaching creative writing. And one of the really nice things about it is it makes you revisit authors or works, and really makes you try and articulate methods and aspects of the craft that work for you. A fun exercise I do with our first years is based on something Ray Bradbury said, that he tended to write a title at the start of his work, and usually it was a concrete noun. He uses examples of the lake, the scythe, the carnival, the skeleton, things that are a bit macabre, like so much of his work. That gave him a focus. And when he found that method, that allowed him to attain the kinds of work he wanted to achieve. So maybe subliminally, I was thinking back to that lesson that we do with our students. And I was using a similar method to help me keep focused in a slightly fractured narrative that doesn't have the flow of the traditional one.
Well, you've said the word theme there. You have a linking theme, you have the title, the context in terms of it being the second person, the use of your in your still beating heart. And then as you go on and on, you've got this theme where you've got Todd's death that obviously involves a heart, let's say.
Yep.
And the situation we find out later on that we may or may not reveal through spoilers. And you can see Eira's numbness changing over time. But I'm wondering if you can expand on this use of, I want to say organs of the body, if that makes sense, and the emotional context of the use of heart and things like that. Is that something you could expand on?
I think so. I mean, it's an interesting one, because certain times when you're writing, you're leaving yourself little nuggets or parcels that you don't necessarily know are there at the time. And then when you go back in the rewriting process, you start to see these parallels or the webs of imagery, which you've, again, summarized so neatly there. That was one of them. And that this idea, firstly, of Todd's death and being stabbed in the heart is what sets the whole thing in motion. But then Eira's emotional state as a result of that. And at the end of the chapter, it says as if some part of it had gone through him into you, or that she's carrying a little shard as well. And I was trying to cultivate, I mean, it's maybe overdone in terms of the fairy tale aspect, but I really liked that. And I liked the idea of the Snow Queen and Hans Christian Andersen and the idea of being emotionally numb. And I kind of saw that is when you mentioned, could the story have happened without Eira in her state or before Todd's death, that she is a kind of Snow Queen and she's carrying that, but also it's a story of renewal and healing for her, and that in helping Gogol and in risking her own life, she's also finding a reason to live again and a new focus. And one of the final images is the two of them holding each other in the cab of the truck and her being heated back to life. So I think that ties to her as well. And then, of course, there's the grimmer, macabre, sinister aspect of the organ trade and the heart that the villains want and how the villains come to an end as well. So I thought hopefully that they seem to start linking together in ways that you don't necessarily plan or foresee. And again, maybe some of that does tie into fairy tale imagery or aspects that have the back of my mind. I'm a big fan of Margaret Atwood's work as well. And I already mentioned Joyce Carol Oates. Keep talking around about, say that the villains are after Gogol's heart, and that ties into is in Snow White. The huntsman's supposed to bring the heart, but there's an exchange for a fake one. So I think there's certain things that were hovering in the back of my mind that I thought could work. But I guess the challenge then would be in depicting them in a narrative that's supposed to be taken as realistic, even if it's got these other semi-mythical or fantastic elements.
Well, that's very interesting. I think I hadn't seen the fairy tale aspect in there and the Snow White.
I mean, that's good in a way, because I think the danger, my worry in using it might be that it becomes a bit forced. So I think we kept trying to tone it down and just have, even just some of the imagery or residual little moments like that. In a way, that's a relief to hear that it didn't feel like too in your face or too over the top, those components of it.
Yeah, no, not at all. It actually answers an unspoken question, I suppose, where I was reading this and I did not by any means expect where it was going. But, that kind of answers the question there, because it does work really, really well in what you've said. I have a completely different question. We have the ending of the book, and our narrator ties everything up for us, gives us an idea of what happens in the future. Is Eira and Gogol's life, is it good?
The life that they end up with.
Yeah.
Despite some of the dark aspects of the narrative and trauma of what they've both lived through and fought through together, I have a soft spot for a kind of a happy ending. I want to believe that it is good. I want to believe that it's hard. In my head, I think there's a moment near the end where she's envisioning that life, and it's kind of got an awareness. He's not going to be like all the other kids. Certain things are always going to be there, but she'll also always be there for him. And that notion of loyalty is really important to me. I think it just comes up. It's one of those themes that I'm always drawn to for whatever reason. And it's in pretty much everything that I do. Family ties, loyalty, the choices we make, where we stick together, how we stick together, and betrayals as well, clearly. But for me, I see that bond now as unbreakable, them together. But also I like to think that maybe it's forged a kind of unbreakable bond between them too.
Well, I'm glad also that you mentioned how you write in like the family aspect and things, because the amount of emotion and relatability just was so apparent in the book between Eira and Gogol, and it really made you feel that you wanted them to continue, you wanted them to do well. Just the way you've written their relationship is just absolutely phenomenal.
Thank you so much. And it's wonderful to hear you say that. And it made me think that without that, then all the other things we've been talking about and the idea of the danger and the trauma and the thrills is meaningless. So thank you. And I should have turned the question around. How did you see their life after, once you got to the end?
Yeah, I know. I hoped it was absolutely brilliant. I hope they get to Disneyland.
Yes.
Yeah, I just hope it's really good. I think definitely the relationship is there.
Yeah, good. And in a way, it's funny talking about, it shows the power of all our imaginations, and we're all like that for all books that we read, that these fictional imaginative creations take on a kind of life where we're rooting for them and we want to imagine an imaginary ending for imaginary characters who aren't real. But it, like you said, it has this emotional impact on us as people, as writers and as readers.
Obviously, it'd be completely and utterly different story, but if there was a sequel, that would be lovely to read.
A domestic drama.
Yes, yeah. Just something completely different. What was the message or takeaway you wanted to leave your readers with?
I don't think I necessarily, up front, I don't think of a message. But I think we've, in a way, talked about all the things that I wanted to pass on. And it comes down to those themes of love and loyalty and a belief that there are at least people out there who can make the right decision and when faced with those kind of terrible circumstances. And at the same time, when you have the narrator admitting his own weakness in the face of similar circumstance or similar kind of threat, then the acknowledgement that not everybody is that strong. So I think I wanted to explore those notions of human frailty, courage, and of course, good and evil. And fundamentally, it kind of comes down to that, and morality and the decisions we make that define us, and to be encouraged by the hopeful ending and the kind of loyalty and love that sees Eira and Gogol through.
I'm just so glad that Eira made the decision she did.
I think it's funny. It came up in my own mind just before sitting down to talk to you. I was like, wow, what a horribly dark book it would be if she didn't decide to protect and look after Gogol and go against her employers. And obviously it wouldn't have been a book I wanted to write.
Mm-hmm. Going to move on to what's next, if I may ask at this early point.
Yeah, well, you've given me the idea for the next book. It's the sequel. It's Eira and Gogol living in rural Wales together.
Hooray.
No, I mean, I'm dodging the question partly because it's a tricky one. I think it's always a tricky one, particularly tricky right now for me. I think authors have responded differently to lockdown. And I've heard some authors say that actually it was quite productive period for them because so much of the daily distractions of our lives have been eliminated and allowed them to generate a lot of content. For me, it was a real struggle. And I say that with full awareness. My struggle is small in comparison to so much else going on. We also had a kind of tough situation, a medical situation in our family during the lockdown. And I've found for the first time that I'm coming up against maybe my limitations, or that I'm not as inspired or energized with my writing in a way that I haven't had pretty much since I started. And that's tough. I think like when you first asked me when we started chatting, I have been feeling better lately and been getting out and enjoying life a little bit, taking our kids out. We got 2 young kids and feeling a bit more free. Being out and about in the world again is going to help me re-engage. Long, convoluted answer to say I don't necessarily know, but I have a few short story ideas, and that lurking at the back of my mind. I have an idea for a novel and something that I want to return to, but nothing firmed up yet, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. So watch this space then.
Yes, there you go. I should have just said that.
So, listeners, links to purchase Your Still Beating Heart are in the episode description. If you have enjoyed this conversation, do subscribe or follow the podcast for future episodes. Tyler, this has been everything I was hoping and more. It's been absolutely fantastic talking to you. It's been wonderful reading your book. And yeah, this conversation has just been so detailed, and just hearing everything that you've put into this book has been wonderful, and it's really added to the reading experience, which I hope it will also do with the listeners as well. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much, Charlie, and thank you for your really perceptive and incisive questions, because I really feel like I was questioned about the book in ways I didn't expect, and that's a good thing. And we didn't have anything prepped or ahead. Sometimes you get questions in advance, or you have certain standard questions that you get as author, but I really feel like I found out a little bit more about the book and the writing experience of it by answering and talking to you. So thank you.
The next interview will be on Monday, the 13th of September. The Wormhole Podcast, episode 44, was recorded on the 16th of August and published on the 23rd of August, 2021. Music and production by Charlie Place.